Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Veronica Gerasimo. I serve as the Assistant Dean of Student Life and Leadership at Hudson County Community College. And as part of our celebration of the Hispanic Heritage Month, we have teamed up with the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce of New Jersey, and we are offering today a conversation on Cuba. We have a guest speaker joining us today, Marco Gonzalez. But today's event will be looking at an overview of the Cuba history, an overview of the political uprising, especially from this past summer, the economic impact on COVID-19 on the country, and how we as individuals can help to support our Cuban students, colleagues, friends, here on and out, especially with everything that is happening more recently. To give a bio on our guest speaker, Marco A. Gonzalez is a seasoned legal professional with significant experience in complex civil litigation, labor and employment, compliance counseling, internal investigations, and white-collar defense. Marco counsels and defends clients in governmental enforcement matters, from the Export Administration Regulations to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, ATAR, and the trade sanctions enforced by the U.S. Office of Foreign Assets Control. Mr. Gonzalez has developed considerable experience in leveraging his language, military, and technical background in representing his clients and minimizing their risk. Mr. Gonzalez's work has extended to represent clients abroad in the Caribbean, Latin America, and Europe. He is also a specialist on the U.S. embargo of Cuba and has represented clients on various matters related to the Cuban asset control regulations. Mr. Gonzalez is a past president and general counsel of the Hispanic Bar Association of New Jersey, a graduate of the Minority Corporate Counsel Association's Academy for Leadership and Inclusion Training, and serves as the outside general counsel of the Statewide Hispanic Chamber of Commerce of New Jersey. And I turn the floor over to Marco Gonzalez. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Veronica. I appreciate the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Let me just jump into it. I think that a knowledge of some background information on the history between Cuba and the United States is important to understand the current policy and the current relationship politically, economically, socially between the United States and Cuba. And so a lot of us go back to the revolution in the end of the 50s, 1959, when the Castro revolution overthrew the government of the prior administration in Cuba and ushered in the communist regime that is still in power in Cuba. But really, I think we need to go back further, briefly, to the end of the 19th century, when the United States and Cuba, when the United States and Spain rather went to war in the Spanish-American War. That started with the mysterious explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor, and that led to the Spanish-American War. And by the end of that war, the United States took control of not only Cuba, but also Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam. And really, since then, the US has had a direct and indirect presence in the affairs of Cuba.
David just called.
And so it's important to understand that background. And right after that war, once Cuba reestablished its independent government, the US then got control of the Guantanamo naval base, which was a prior Spanish naval base there and has been there ever since through this lease agreement with no expiration. And that presence of the US still remains today and is another element of the thorny relationship between the countries. After the Castro regime took over the government in Havana in 1959, you've had a number of other events that also led to friction between the companies. You had, of course, the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1969, in which the US, through covert agencies, including the CIA, put together a mercenary army, if you want to call it that, of some Cuban exiles to invade Cuba with the hope of promoting another revolution to overthrow the Castro regime, and that ended badly. And it was a big fiasco for the Kennedy administration at the time. And then you had the famous missile crisis with Cuba, the United States, and the Soviet Union. And for those of you who are not familiar with that, in 1962, the summer of 62, you had US surveillance aircraft, the U-2 surveillance aircraft, picked up unusual shipments from the Soviet Union to Cuba that basically led to the placement of intermediate ballistic missiles in Cuba from the Soviet Union with a direct access or range to a good part of the southwest of the United States. Needless to say, this completely freaked out the Kennedy administration and led to a 13-day crisis that put not only the US, Cuba, and Russia at the point of nuclear war, but the rest of the world, between NATO forces and the Cold War forces, the Warsaw Pact, ran from the Soviet Union. And so after that, the Soviets began, that did not end. So that crisis ended. If you want to know more about it, Robert Kennedy's memoir on 13 Days is an excellent book on that. You can find that on Amazon. But, given that experience, given that history, led to more animosity between the US and Cuba. And then after that, what you had was Cuba become largely dependent on the Soviet Union with influxes. There's one estimate of $11 million in aid every day from the Soviet Union to Cuba that propped up the Cuban economy in light of the economic embargo that the Kennedy regime put in place after the Castro overthrow of the Cuban government there. And so that led to this Cold War situation between the countries that kind of existed through the 70s, through the 80s, when in 1991, the fall of the Soviet Union led to that aid being stopped to Cuba. So Cuba put itself now in a very dire economic situation because they weren't getting that aid from the former Soviet Union. That ushered in a period, what they call the special period, where you had almost a collapse of the Cuban economy that led to rations of food, of energy, of medicine. I think the average weight of the Cuban person dropped 12 pounds on average across the country because of the economic situation there. So that collapse of the economy because of the lack of funds and aid by the Soviet Union, along with the US embargo that was still in place, was pretty devastating to the island. That also led to an uprising in 1994, known as the Maleconoso uprising, that sought changes by the people in Cuba. They wanted, more economic freedom. They wanted a change to the economy, which, didn't take place. And so that suffering continued until really when, Cuba found another benefactor in Venezuela with the former Chavez regime in receiving a lot of aid from Venezuela, mostly in the form of energy, in exchange for some Cuban doctors and missions to Cuba. But that just was a temporary Band-Aid for Cuba because, once the collapse of the Venezuelan economy took place around 2017, that aid stopped. And so Cuba saw itself again in a similar situation where one of their patrons, this time Venezuela, was not providing, could not provide because of the collapse of its own economy, aid to Cuba. And so by 2017, though, you've had the Obama administration relax a lot of the rules through executive order on the embargo, the restrictions of the embargo to Cuba. So you saw an increase in authorized US travel to Cuba. You saw an increase in remittances from the US to Cuba. You saw the birth of small informal businesses in Cuba, a lot of them restaurants and other small businesses that catered to the new influx of US travelers to the island. And there was an expectation that, again, this is the Obama administration policy, that with greater influx of Americans traveling to Cuba, more economic transactions as allowed under the restrictions and the regulations, that this would hopefully promote change internally in Cuba. Unfortunately, we saw that change with the prior administration, the Trump administration, which re-engaged those restrictions in allowing for travel. So all of that pulled back. Air travel. You had cruise ships that had plans to go to Cuba. Many of them were going there, again, in support of the Cuban people, which was the regulatory authorization, educational support. So the regulations allowed for this excess travel. Were there abuses by the US, some US persons going down there and doing more tourist activities? Yes. Was the government going after those people? Not really. But the policy of the Obama administration was to increase activity between US persons, US companies, and the Cuban people directly in order to effect change in the island. And there was some indications that that was starting to work. But that was pulled back by the prior administration. And now, since 2017, what we saw has been, along with the end and reduction of aid from Venezuela, a very dire situation in Cuba. Then you have COVID-19, and that brought the island to even greater economic despair, because they had to, as part of their pandemic restrictions, restrict not only travel to the island, but the lucrative European tourists and the Canadian tourists and Latin American tourists that used to go and vacation in Cuba. So all of this put together has put Cuba in a difficult situation economically, politically, and socially down there. And that in turn was part of what led to the recent uprisings that happened this past summer in Cuba. And so with that, that's just a broad overview, and I like to take questions and maybe engage in a discussion in more detail about these areas that we could discuss.
Thank you so much. Does anybody have any questions to start? Or Mary, if you wanted to take this opportunity to share a little bit about your experience in Cuba as well. We'll open to whoever wants to go first. Oh wait, Mary, you're muted. Let's get you unmuted.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I worked for International Ministries of the American Baptist Churches in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania for 32 years. I worked for the area director for Latin America and the Caribbean, and Cuba was part of that portfolio. In 1997, I traveled to Cuba with a group of American Baptist executive ministers to Santiago de Cuba and stayed in the home of the president of the Eastern Cuba Baptist Convention. And I went along as a translator for one of the executive ministers. And during the time that we were there in August and the beginning of September 1997, she spoke in various churches throughout Santiago de Cuba. And so I served as her translator. And I went to Cuba again in February of 2012. And this time I went with a group from Upper Marion Baptist Church in King of Prussia. And they were working on the reconstruction of a church in El Cristo, which is part of the area of Santiago de Cuba. So I was able to see things from the perspective. The first trip was more of a fact-finding mission for the executive ministers to see what life was like in the Cuban Baptist churches, and to be able to learn from the pastors there how they were doing evangelism so that the American Baptist pastors could bring back those ideas and use them in their churches. And my second trip was one where we were actually doing physical labor at the church in El Cristo. So there were two different kinds of trips, but one of the things that I saw while I was there on both occasions was how difficult life was for the average Cuban person. For people, the member, if I can say this, Marco, the members of the party, I don't think that they really have a difficult time because they have access to what they need in order to live. But for the average Cuban, they're working with ration cards, their rice, their beans, and oil, and the basic things that they need just for daily survival don't always last them for an entire month. They might get to the middle of the month and run out of what they need. And so my feeling was that the people were the ones who were really suffering. And
Mary, yeah, that's I'm glad you mentioned that, because one of the things that I hear a lot is, what has changed since the revolution in the late 50s, and what were the causes of that revolution, and what are the causes now of the uprising. And so, you may have a lot of historians that may differ on what are the causes of the 59 revolution. But I
right,
think most will say it's four things. And this is where it gets to your just comment. Number one, there was American sentiment at the time with the US involving itself in Cuba. And you still have that now. Second, you had the negative effects on Cuban society on the overdependence on and the abuses concerning some of the industries down there, including sugar production.
Right.
Third, and this brings us to your point, was the fragmented and divided nature of Cuban society in the 50s. And you see that now, you have the haves and the haves not. Back then, it was, the private industries and those with resources and capital that had access to food and other luxuries of life, and then the poor didn't. And now you have, you basically have the same type of situation, right? People are not getting the basics that they require, that they need. And this is now 60 years after the revolution.
Right, right.
And the people are suffering. Those who have, mostly those connected, who are either part of the party or are the party, are not going through those difficulties.
No.
Right?
It's painful to see. And, things were really difficult back in July when they had the uprising. And I think that from what I gathered, there were a lot of people who were disappeared. And, something, when things like that happen, it really is a big concern. And I don't feel like, I'm sorry to say this, but enough attention was paid by the US government to the situation there and why the people were, why there were uprisings. So that's just my perspective.
Yeah, what I regularly read the Cuban press, which of course you have to read with a very cautious eye, because a lot of the press, most of the press down there is controlled by the Cuban government. But
Exactly.
you can see and read things between the lines. And that, in addition to some of the independent blogs that are in social media, I'll talk about them a little later, but that, a lot of them were calling for the resignation of the new president there,
Of Miguel Diaz-Canel.
And because he had promised when he came into power to do significant changes that would formally expand small businesses,
right,
and to reduce government regulations of those businesses. And I'm talking about private businesses, small businesses. Before he took over and before all these different issues happened, during the time when the Obama administration policies were in effect, you had a lot of informal businesses in the form of restaurants. People became taxi drivers, different little private, on the side, unofficial businesses to get US dollars from these US traveling tourists that helped them economically. But when that was shut down in 2017, a lot of those businesses collapsed. And so the new president promised to make it more formal. That didn't happen. And what happened? Poverty levels out. A lot of the same conditions that you saw in the late 50s that led to the Castro revolution. And a lot of these protesters, Cancel took immediate action. If you look at and you read the papers down there, they had a very strong arm in terms of tamping down these protests. They shut down the internet. And then when they brought it back up, they did filters for social media that was being used by the local Cubans to organize these protests. And like you said, there are reports that people have disappeared, presumably being imprisoned, or God forbid, worse. And so, the people are hurting down there in the island very much.
Right.
And it's consistent with what you just said, Mary, what I'm hearing on the ground, and what you could read between the lines through some of these independent online blogs of what's happening down there.
Right. The other thing that's really frustrating is that I'm retired now, but when I was working, there was a time period where we were able to send remittances to our partner in Santiago, Cuba, and for projects that they were working on. They would submit projects to us. We would write up the projects, and they, of course, would have to be approved by different committees. But I would say up until maybe like 2012, we didn't have a problem. But then we had to go through, I'm trying to think of something called global exchange. And they would have to do what they called due diligence to make sure that what we were sending was in no way going to support the regime.
Right.
So, and then we got to, and they would convert the dollars into euros and then send the money as euros to Banco Financiero Internacional in Santiago. But then we got to a point where we weren't even able to do that. And I think a lot of it had to do with OFAC, the regulations of the Office of Foreign Assets Control. So
yeah, so during the Obama administrations, the regulations, the OFAC regulations, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that later and give you some resources so folks can do their own research on the Cuban asset control regulations that's enforced and administered by the Office of Foreign Asset Control, which is a division of the U.S. Department of Treasury.
right.
So basically the embargo. So so what happened was in the Trump administration tightened the restrictions to only allow certain limited remittances from family members here to family members in Cuba. Before, you could have third parties like charity organizations issue remittances to Cuba, but that has been reduced through changes in the regulations. And that has not changed in this administration for a bunch of reasons, mostly having to do with politics regarding Cuba, the holdup in Congress because of Biden's twin spending programs, and the upcoming midterm elections next year.
Right.
And here in New Jersey, we have a big Cuban community, and in South Florida that still advocate for a strong embargo against Cuba. And so for a bunch of different reasons, the Biden administration hasn't done anything as of yet to loosen that up. When he was a candidate, he promised to do so, but then, because of the ongoing pandemic, vaccine hesitancy, if you look at responses for the administration, why they haven't done anything more, those are some of the things that you're going to see out there. And politically, some folks are saying it'll be very damaging to the midterm elections for the Democrats if they were to introduce legislation easing up of the embargo, or if Biden were to take at this time executive actions to loosen the embargoes, to bring it up to where they were under the Obama administration. And so I just don't see Biden doing anything now that may change if he's successful within the next few months, like getting his twin spending packages passed. And that could probably give him the momentum to do something. But from what I've seen, and my sources in Washington are telling me, is that they don't want to do something piecemeal. They want to do something big. But I don't see that politically viable right now. I could be wrong. That could change. But I just don't see that happening, unfortunately, to the detriment of the Cuban people, because those remittances are very important and was a big part of the informal economy of local Cubans. When you have third parties here, charity organizations and other groups provide support. Again, this is all legal. This would have been legal under the OFAC regulations at the time, but now they're not. So that's the distinction.
Isn't it true, Marco, that in order to lift the embargo, it requires an act of Congress?
So the embargo, is not one statute or law. It's several that have been passed since Kennedy's time. Some of them are based on a World War I Dealing with the Enemy Act, I believe it's called, something to that. So there's a bunch of statutes, and I might as well refer everybody now. So to learn more about the details of the embargo, you can Google OFAC, OFAC, space Cuba, space FAQ, and that'll take you to the OFAC webpage. And that page has pretty much everything there that you need to know. I'm going on it now.
I think I got it. The U.S. Department of Treasury website.
Yes, so if you Google Cuba, OFAC, OFAC, FAQ, they have pretty good fact summary sheets that are there that will help you go and understand the regulations. So the way it works, and I don't want to get too legalistic, if you want to look at the statutes, right? The statutes are there. So you have the Trade Sanctions Reform and Export Enhancement Act of 2000. You have the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996. You have the Cuban Liberty and Democratic Solidarity Act of 1996, the Cuban Democracy Act of 1992, and the Trading with the Enemy Act, which was enacted in World War I. So all those statutes provide the statutory basis for the embargo. But the meat and potatoes of how it's enforced is through the Cuban Asset Control Regulations that's administered by OFAC. And so to get an understanding of the OFAC regulations, you could go through this webpage, and you could go through the regs and read them. They're interesting read, probably very legalistic and technical, but the fact sheets and the FAQs, there's a most recent FAQ from August 2021. There's one from October 2020. And those, of course, anything prior, so anything after December 2016 or January 2017 will be changes that were made by the Trump administration, constricting those provisions in the OFAC regs that allowed for greater transactions, economic, social, political, with Cuba and the Cuban people. So Mary, the answer, so that's the long answer. The short answer is that the president, in his or her executive capacity, can make changes to these regulations that allow for greater transactions, economic, travel to Cuba and with the Cuban people. I think that Obama really tested that and made the best. So he pushed, and the guy was a constitutional scholar, so he knew what he was doing. There was some attacks to those regulations, but they went nowhere because that administration did a good job in making sure that they were within their executive power rights to make those changes. But to make lasting and profound changes to the whole structure of the embargo, the Congress would need to act on these 5 statutes that are on the bottom of that webpage in order to make profound changes to the embargo and to lift those restrictions. I just don't see that happening right now, at least in the short term, because of all the things I said before. The politics are not ripe. You know, you have a lot of Cuban American politicians, both on the Republican and Democratic side, that are pro-embargo. And so I just, you may have seen probably in 2015, 16, 17, maybe the climate would have been right once the Obama administration opened up diplomatic relations again with Cuba in 2016, but that time spot was very narrow, and there was nothing done politically to make any changes. I think eventually that would happen, because at the end of the day, you know, I was one of the first in my family born here. My father left Cuba in 1958. And you know, I think a lot of people objectively can say that the embargo did not effectuate any change there. And some argue that change has to come from within. But then again, how can that happen? You have these uprisings that are continually brought down by the Cuban security forces there. And so, you know, it's a replaying of history all over again. I think that the way to do it is through more engagement. That's my personal opinion. Like what was happening in the prior administration. Other people of good faith, you know, sincerely disagree with that. But you know, I've been in touch with, there's a new generation of Cuban leaders there who were born after the revolution. So they don't have that revolutionary pedigree. You have people that have traveled across, you know, to Europe, some here, you know, you have a lot of Cuban students that have come here to study, which is allowed under the regulations. And I think that that's the way to go, more engagement, not less. But again, you have people of good faith who disagree with that. But I just don't see, after 60 years, you have a situation that really has not effectuated any change in Cuba. And I don't know how continuing that policy is going to make changes there.
I definitely do not have this is very educational for me. I do not know a lot of this. So how does the political elections work in Cuba? Because I'm not even sure change could come in the government form there, but as you say, we have new generations of people and students and leaders, and you have people that are part of the uprising, but they're being shut down. When does like a new leadership even happen, or is there really no hope of that?
Yeah, I mean, again, not to get too technical, but everything runs through the party,
Mhm.
right? And, there are candidates and there may
Yeah.
be some selectivity amongst candidates at the local level, but they are all members of the party. And it's all very much orchestrated. So there's really no democratic representative process. On paper, they claim that it is, but it's a one-party system, and everybody who can run, even if you have more than one candidate for a position, they're all going to be party loyalists.
Yeah,
So there's
yeah.
really, again, I'm not an expert on internal Cuban politics in that how that can change, but I could tell you that the younger people that are in the diplomatic corps, for example, people that before the pandemic I would meet, Cuba has a consulate for the UN in New York, and so those diplomats can travel, I think, beyond 25 miles of the consulate to the UN, the Cuban mission to the UN. And so the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce has in the past sponsored activities and forums that invited some of these young Cuban diplomats, and we engage in a vigorous debate with them about a lot of these issues. Again, this is all pre-COVID and pre the current economic conditions in the island. And you can see a difference between those folks and some of the older folks in terms of perspective and how they saw the world, how they saw US. And, a lot of that change in perspective led to, the re-engagement and negotiations that led to the re-engagement of the opening of each embassy in 2016. And again, with the loosening of restrictions by Obama, more contact with and greater economic activity between persons in the US and the Cuban people. We still have the embassy there, although it is a skeleton crew. Some of you folks may have heard about this mysterious illness that affected a bunch of the staff at the US Embassy. The current view amongst, the experts, I'm not one of them, but what I read is that the Russians are using some type of microwave device, not only in Cuba, but some of the other embassies in Asia, for example, that are resulting in some headaches and other brain activity that's causing issues with certain people. And so, that's a completely weird, sounds like some sci-fi novel, but it's actual, real, true life. So you have a situation, putting aside all these other issues, where yes, there's still an embassy in Havana, US Embassy there, but it's on a skeleton staff. And because of COVID, there's very limited, if any, activity there, which wasn't what was happening in 2016 when the embassy opened up. And so that's something that needs to be dealt with, I think. And that's another impediment to, the full restoration of activity for that embassy. And so that, it's hard for Cubans then to get visas to come here because the embassy is in a skeleton framework. And so that's another element that has to be dealt with. And politically, it'll be hard for the Biden administration to open up that embassy until they figure out this issue about this mysterious, injuries that are happening to the staff down there.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, it's really crazy when you think about all this stuff.
Yeah.
In the past history. But, I know that you guys wanted me to talk about a little bit about what you can do
Yeah.
to help the people there. You could look at the regulations and the fact sheets so you could get better educated. A lot of it is very readable. And to the extent it's not, and you need some help going through that, please reach out to me, send me an email. You can find me on the internet. I'm on LinkedIn and I'm also on Facebook, so you can find me. But here's what you could do. Here's what and now because of the restrictions that are in place, it's hard. And I want to caution everybody that anyone who's a US citizen, who's a legal resident here, anyone who's a foreign national who is here in the US or works for a US company is subject to the OFAC Cuban asset control regulations and the restrictions. So you have to be very careful in terms of any type of transaction, money that you send over there, to make sure, like Mary said, even when they allowed remittances, they had to go through these due diligence process to make sure they were complying. Because even if you're a European entity, if that entity has a relationship with a US bank, right? And there are these mechanisms in place that you think, okay, I'm a French national, I work for a French organization, but if that organization has a bank account with a US entity, guess what? You have to comply with the US restrictions. It's not fair, it's messed up, but that's the fact. So be careful what you do and make sure that what you're doing complies with the law. There's these sites that are out there that you could probably find that purport to allow you to do make contributions that may not be in compliant with the regs. As an attorney, I cannot advise you to do that, but be careful, do your due diligence. So what can you do? Number one, and this sounds corny, but it's so true, write to your representatives in Congress, in the House and in the Senate. Write to them like a real letter, because you could go online and do the digital thing, but if you send a handwritten letter, that's like a 500 emails to your congressperson, because they see that that's an old school way of doing it, and that has the greatest impact. Write a letter to your representative in Congress, to your senators, asking for more US humanitarian intervention in Cuba. And you can listen to what's happening in Cuba. You can, depending on the day, and the bloggers down there are very creative to get the word out. So one of the famous Cuban bloggers is Yoani Sanchez at 14Y Medio and El Toque. Yoani, the Yoani Sanchez. She is fantastic. So you want to hear what she's saying. And Abraham Jimenez Enoa is another famous blogger that you could get information on what's happening there. The other is, internet access and phone access in Cuba by Cubans is very expensive for the average Cuban citizen. So you have an organization called Cubanos Palante, PA''Lante. They have an Instagram page that has updated information, pretty accurate updated information on what you can do to help Cubans in the island. And another good website with, again, resources and charities that are able to provide assistance to Cubans right now is www.cubacandela.com, CUBACANDELA.com. And so those are some of the things you can do. And, you could also go to some of the Cuban press down there to find out what's going on. Now, again, I caution you, it's within, these are state-owned, but if you Google in Spanish, like Prensa Cubana, for example, or even in English, Cuban press, you can find a bunch of websites that you have access here, down there. And, a lot of it has to do with the news. Let me see, let me get you some websites.
I was gonna say, I did a quick Google Cuban press, and who knew that was an exercise?
Yeah, I mean, it's
Cuban
hard.
press is like a muscle exercise too.
Yeah.
So be careful with your Google.
Now, BBC has a good Spanish language. BBC is good. Some of Spain's, let's see. So 14 and medio, which is Ioani, is 14, www.14ymedio.com. So that's an independent website. You could go to, now the official is granma.cu, www.granma.cu. Again, I caution you, it's within the lens of the Cuban government, but you can see, and I think it's instructive to see what they're reporting there. And I do that on a regular basis to find out what's going on there by their perspective. The other thing, and I know we didn't get too much into this, and I know you wanted me to talk about COVID-19 in Cuba. So the latest about COVID-19, and you could get this, the CDC and the World Health Organization and the Europe Center for Disease Prevention and Control publish data. Again, it's hard to determine the veracity of this data, but it's pretty, all those organizations pulled together in the Times, the New York Times. So as of this past August, there was a high of 17,285 new cases a day, with a 7-day average of a little over 10,000 positive cases. That has dropped to last week of 3,600 cases a day as of last week, and a 7-day average of 3,500 cases. If you look at the Cuban government's numbers, it's much lower than that. But still, it's good news that it's going down. Last month, Reuters reported that Cuba is allowing a staggered reopening of its economy with the reopening of restaurants, shopping centers, and beaches in provinces where there has been a significant reduction of COVID. Why is that important? That's important because by doing that, they can then say to travelers in Europe, travelers in Canada, Mexico, Central and South America, you could come back to Cuba if you're vaccinated and you don't need to do a test. So if you could show proof of vaccination and you're from those countries, you can travel to these provinces, and they're gonna start opening up to allow for that activity. So again, this data is hard to verify, but it's said, the Cuban government says that 86% of its residents in Havana has been vaccinated. And I think the focus is there, is that where a lot of the tourists tourism industry is. It's in Havana, it's in some of the larger cities. The other thing is that in September, the World Health Organization announced that it started to formally evaluate for approval Cuba's COVID-19 vaccines. They came out late to the gate. You know, everybody knows that Cuba has a somewhat sophisticated health industry in the island. And they developed their main vaccine is called Abdala. It's a 3-shot vaccine developed by the Cuban Center for Generic Engineering and Biology. But it's a conventional shot, not the one based on the newer messenger RNA like Pfizer and Moderna. And they claim, the government there claims that it's 92% effective, but we'll see what happens after the WHO evaluation. So look out for that. And you know, look, I hope it's that effective because it helps the people there and to kickstart hopefully the economy again. So that is the scoop. And the other thing, you know, Cuba did start off with the right policies in place to limit the pandemic. But then last summer, when the numbers went down, they started allowing tourists from abroad to come in, and the numbers just shot back up and they had to close. So it was something that I think many people would argue, and health experts, that the administration there botched that response. But hopefully with this new vaccine, which by the way, they're trying to get WHO authorization so they could export it. So we'll see, hopefully it is effective because that will help out, you know, the dire situation in Cuba by the Cuban people themselves.
Marco, this was amazing and super informative. I thank you so much for your expertise. And Mary, thank you so much for coming and sharing your experience and your expertise as well. I love that we've left with action items and ways that we can help. The remittance and the change in that, I'm sure, as I know you all have said, has been very, very hard to have to deal with, especially I'm sure people who want to help their families at home.
Veronica, before I leave, if I can,
for
those of you who want to find out more, the history of US-Cuban affairs actually goes back to our revolution. And the Cuban Research Institute at Florida International University is a great resource. They also have a chronological timeline that dates back to 1775. So there's a lot of reliable, reputable online sites that you could get information on the history between Cuba and the US. And also, you know, if you want to find out more about the OFAC regulations themselves, go to that OFAC webpage that I said about before. And there's a lot of easy to read information there about those regulations.
Thank you so much again. Perfect. I put some of those links in the chat, so if anybody wants to grab those, that's a lot of really helpful information. But thank you so much again for your time, Marco. And thank you so much to the Statewide Hispanic Chamber of Commerce of New Jersey, Jairo and Danilo, the Office of Student Life and Leadership at Hudson County Community College, as well as our Speech and Foreign Languages Department for making all of this happen. And we will, you know, this isn't over now. You planted a lot of seeds that we can take with us in terms of supporting and continuing to get the information out, because, you know, knowledge is power. The more we know, the more we speak out about it, the more that potential change can happen.
Before we leave, Marco, can I mention something? You know, our Congressman Albiro Cirrus, he is Cuban descent. Do you think reaching out to Albiro will help? Because you did mention writing letters to all of our Congress. You know, do you suggest that we can reach out to, you know, Albiro or Senator Menendez any of
Reach
our
out to them.
politicians?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, let your voices be heard. You know, that's it's, and I'm serious when I say write a letter. Write a letter. Look, you know, they do have those individuals. You know, especially Senator Menendez. He's a good man. I remember when he was teaching at Rutgers, when he was the mayor, and you know, he's a good man. He's a progressive supporter of New Jersey, but you know, he has a particular policy on Cuba, and I think that, you know, writing to him, writing to whoever your representative is in Congress, they're not going to fault you for that, because that's what it's all about. As long as you're respectful, you're courteous, and you know, you make your voice heard, you know, they expect that, and they know that that's part of the democratic process. And by doing it by hand shows how serious and sincere you are, even if they ultimately disagree with you. But at the end of the day, you know, the only way that we can have our representatives in Congress do something is to have our voices be heard. And if enough of us do that, you know, I'm hopeful, and I'm a glass half full type of guy, that change will happen, you know? And so I advocate that, and I think that nothing's impossible. So, you know, we always change human beings, especially those of good faith and those armed with knowledge and facts, you know, we can change our opinion on things. And I think sending those letters by hand, by mail, I think at the end of the day, if they don't make a difference, it certainly plants a seed where they know that you have a good part of the population that may respectfully think differently from them. So go for it, Angela.
Thank you, Marco. Thank you so much. Oh, and Mary Weaver. Oh my goodness. Thank you.
You're
You are
welcome.
definitely very knowledgeable in the area. I appreciate it all. I really appreciate the conversation. And I hope it doesn't end today.
Thank you.
Definitely will not. Well, thank you all again. Have a wonderful rest of your day, afternoon, and you know, let's keep doing it, doing the work.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay,
Pleasure to be
thank
here.
you.
Bye,
Thank
Veronica.
you.
Bye. Thank you so
Ciao.
much, Marco.
Adios.